Here is another devlog update for Gardener, with a bit more progress since last one. The tree structure is now realistically simulated and completely different than in Creatura. We're still using the legacy textures and meshes for most part, but the generation rules for both annual and perennial plants are now unique for Gardener. Those trees here are of perennial growth. While annuals die off at the end of season, the perennial trees continue the growth and branch out instead. Each step of the growth we see here is basically fast forwarding to the next season, something that will take a considerable amount of time for the players. Over last month I've spent mostly pushing the performance to the metal limit. Here we have 100 plants consisting of up to 65,000 nodes for around 150-250 million rendered vertices total, and at 570 XT running this in 1080p, this renders somewhere between 20 to 30 FPS. At this point, this looks to be hardware limit without much opportunity to optimize it further. Classical optimizations like level of details or culling would require batching the culls per plant, which in this case increases GPU cull count from 20 to 2000. And while in synthetic LOD tests, replacing all meshes with billboards gained around 5 to 8 FPS, from smaller poly count, just splitting the batches for different detail levels drops it down by 20. For the same reason, no culling can be realistically applied in this case. Simply pushing out all the batches to GPU as fast as possible profiles out to be the fastest rendering solution, at least which I can find. However, in a game like Gardener, the challenge isn't only in rendering trees, but performing interactions between the player and tree nodes too. So rendering 250 million vertices itself is quite a complex task, but without the ability to select them and cut, it's not much more impressive to the player than just rendering a pre-made, non-interactive tree model. In Creatura, the largest plants were 2 orders of magnitude less complex for gardener trees, as they can now consist of up to 65,000 nodes. And even in Creatura, providing interactive feedback to players wasn't easy. It's just not feasible to create a scene consisting of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, active colliders required so the player actions in the game world can be detected by a raycast. Most games solve this issue by distance culling, dynamically toggling and generating the required colliders. In production like SnowRunner, only trees in the closest vicinity of the active track calculate physics with attached colliders. This is a reasonable approach to manage a couple hundred colliders, but it doesn't solve the problems in magnitude of Creatura or Gardener. And to deal with it, in Creatura, each plant on the scene had its own trigger collider, a simple bounding box that wasn't really interacting with game physics, but would call for generation of detailed local colliders every time another trigger passed through it. The other trigger was a long capsule which was meticulously positioned between player viewpoint and the cursor world position, and it was governing actual colliders generation and unloading. And it is a solution, but this solution isn't very good. It decimates the amount of active colliders required at once, but still requires each plant to iterate through every node, checking if it's in or out of the so-called pre-collider bounds. And this on itself is a fairly bad approach due to the nature of always rectangular bounds, activating at certain angles, more nodes when required, and pivot positions are not necessarily best indicators of where the node is visually. So while this method generally worked in Gardener, it was definitely more resource intensive than what would be acceptable for the gameplay fidelity. So one of the first implementations of Gardener was to alpha check leaves colliding with the player, passing raycasts through non-opaque parts of the texture. It was a huge accuracy boost over Creatura, and while it was calculated fully on the CPU, it sparked interesting proof of concept, because why bother with physics at all when we have the node to select straight in front of us on the screen. Modern shaders are capable of any computation, especially if the code doesn't involve conditionals. The ifs can be executed as shader code, but GPUs are simply not really optimized for them. However, for the purpose of this exercise, let's assume I'm an idiot who just doesn't care and implemented a writable compute buffer into the plant shader with some questionable conditional code that checks if the displayed pixel is behind the cursor position. So as of now, Gardener has new shader-based plant node selection system. It is as accurate as possible, as it returns the player exactly pixel-perfect selected node, even taking into consideration the earlier mentioned alpha checks, while not involving any overhead on the CPU side. And not only does it doesn't require runtime generation of many colliders, it also reduces code complexity and memory footprint. I'm not entirely sure this is a new idea, but this so-called shader scan technique might present a good alternative to classic physics-based feedback resolving, such as hit scan in multiplayer shooters, as it gives one-to-one representation of on-screen visuals and frees resources required to maintain collider transforms and interactions. Next update should implement the drop zone containers, places where collected fruits can be turned, and some basic UI. And once that's done, we'll release the first closed alpha build. For now, that's all.